For our second example here today, we're going to be solving 2 cosine of x minus secant of x is equal to 0. Like that first one, we do have 2 different trigonometric expressions in here. We've got a cosine and a secant, but this time neither one of them is squared. However, there is a relationship between cosine and secant. I know that cosine of x is the same as 1 over secant of x. And I also know that secant of x is the same as 1 over cosine of x. Now, since I'm fonder of working with cosine, I think I want to change everything in here to cosines. So I would want to replace this secant of x. So this would say 2 cosine of x minus 1 over cosine of x equals 0. Now I've got a cosine of x in the denominator, which is very difficult to solve for. So the first thing I would do is I'd want to clear that fraction. And I do that just by multiplying both sides of the equation by the denominator. So this is one of those lovely algebraic techniques that you should have under your belt, ready to use whenever. So if I multiply by cosine of x here on the left side, I have to distribute it. So cosine of x times 2 cosine of x would be 2 cosine squared of x. Cosine of x times 1 over x would be 1. And a 0 times cosine of x is 0. Now this equation is a lot easier to solve. It is quadratic. However, there is no cosine of x term. So to solve, I'm just going to get the cosine squared of x by itself by adding 1 and dividing by 2. And then I'm going to solve by taking square roots of both sides of the equation. Now, whenever you take the square root of both sides of an equation, you have to remember to use a plus or minus sign. So the square root of a square would give me just cosine of x. And on the right, I have plus or minus, and I need the square root of 1/2. And when you square root a fraction, you have to square root the numerator and the denominator separately. So I'm going to write it like this. Square root of 1, of course, is just 1. The square root of 2 is not a nice, pretty number, so I would leave it as square root of 2. But that gives me something with a radical in the denominator, which we do have to rationalize. So to rationalize that, we're going to multiply by root 2 over root 2, a fancy version of the number 1. So now that would give me cosine of x is equal to plus or minus. And multiplying fractions together, you just multiply top times top and bottom times bottom. So on the top, 1 times root 2 is root 2. On the bottom, root 2 times root 2 is 2. So now finally, I have cosine of x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 2 over 2. And I do recognize that square root of 2 over 2 is one of my nice values on the unit circle. So I'm ready to find my angles. So I do have a plus or minus square root of 2 over 2. So cosine is positive in quadrants 1 and 4, because that's where the x's are positive. And it's negative in quadrants 2 and 3. So that means this one's going to have an answer in all 4 quadrants. My reference angle for this one, where the x value is root 2 over 2, is pi over 4. So in quadrant 1, that's pi over 4. In quadrant 2, 3 pi over 4. Quadrant 3, 5 pi over 4. And in quadrant 4, that's 7 pi over 4. And so these would be all of my solutions on the interval from 0 to 2 pi. And now you're going to try this example and then answer on the Google form.